You know that feeling when you leave a house for the last time, turning the key, half sure you'll never cross the threshold again? Imagine doing it, not with a suitcase, but with an empire at your back and a warship waiting in the harbor. One April morning in 1919, Grand Duchess Xenia Alexandrovna Romanov, big sister to Russia's final Tsar, walked down the gangplank of HMS Marlborough and whispered into her diary, "It's over. We are real refugees, homeless." Tonight we'll trace the shockwaves of that single sentence across 40 years of exile, through bomb shrapnel rattling a grace and favour window at Hampton Court, through a nun named Mother Martha who vanished with a secret fortune, through a diamond scandal that embarrassed Buckingham Palace, and through watercolor pansies that still surface in British antique shops. No dusty lecture, just the raw, restless heartbeat of one Romanov who refused to surrender her humanity when the palaces fell. Childhood and education, 1875-1894. Xenia was born in 1875 in the opulent nursery of St. Petersburg's Anichkov Palace. As a member of the Romanov imperial family, she entered the world surrounded by luxury and royal traditions, where grandeur and privilege defined her earliest days. However, her childhood soon took a turn marked by stark contrasts, influenced by major political upheavals that reshaped her family's life and instilled in her a sense of resilience from a young age. Following the assassination of her grandfather, Emperor Alexander II, by an anarchist's bomb in 1881, the Romanov family withdrew from the bustling life of St. Petersburg for safety reasons. They relocated to the windswept and isolated Gachina Palace, a far cry from the urban splendor they had known. This shift introduced a paradoxical upbringing, blending the remnants of royal extravagance with a more austere and practical existence. In Gachina, Xenia's education was shaped by the vision of Empress Maria Feodorovna, originally Princess Dagmar of Denmark, who aimed to raise tough, adaptable children rather than delicate glass figurines. Xenia learned to sleep on simple army cots, endure invigorating cold baths at dawn to build endurance, and even carve toy swords alongside her brothers. These rigorous routines not only toughened her physically, but also cultivated a lifelong attitude of hands-on involvement and determination in facing challenges. Marriage, motherhood, and WUI service, 1894-1918. In 1894, Xenia married Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich, affectionately known as Sandro, in what was portrayed as a fairy tale wedding. Sandro was a charismatic and adventurous figure, and their union initially seemed idyllic within the aristocratic circles. Together, they had 7 children, which further solidified their family's standing in the Romanov dynasty. The harsh lessons from her youth prepared Xenia to be a woman of action. During the World War I, she personally funded an entire hospital trained to provide medical care for wounded soldiers on the front lines. Additionally, she served as the chair of the Xenia Institute, which specialized in producing artificial limbs for war amputees. These initiatives highlighted her commitment to social responsibility, extending far beyond the confines of courtly life and demonstrating her proactive role in humanitarian efforts. Although their marriage began with promise, it slowly deteriorated due to Sandro's penchant for adventure and eventual infidelity. This narrative became a favorite topic of court gossip, evolving from a romantic ideal to a publicly acknowledged separation. In time, the couple lived on separate continents, yet they never pursued a formal divorce. In one letter, Xenia dismissively remarked that divorce was too expensive and too public, reflecting her pragmatic and stoic approach to personal hardships. Revolution, escape, and first exile, 1917-1919, following the February 1917 revolution that toppled the Russian monarchy, the Romanov family faced immediate peril as the political landscape crumbled around them. Grand Duchess Xenia Alexandrovna, sister of Tsar Nicholas II, along with other surviving members of the imperial clan, was compelled to flee southward to the rugged cliffs of Crimea in an attempt to escape the advancing chaos of civil war and Bolshevik forces. They sought refuge at Aitodor, Xenia's own estate overlooking the Black Sea, where the once opulent life of the Romanovs was reduced to a precarious existence under constant surveillance. Armed guards patrolled outside the estate's gates, monitoring every movement and ensuring the family's isolation from the outside world. Amid this tension, Xenia's teenage sons found fleeting moments of normalcy by fishing for mackerel in the waters below the cliffs, a simple activity that contrasted sharply with their former privileged upbringing in palaces filled with grandeur and servants. As the situation in Crimea deteriorated with the approach of the Red Army in early 1919, King George V of the United Kingdom, Xenia's first cousin, intervened by dispatching the British battleship HMS Marlborough to evacuate the remaining Romanovs. This rescue operation, ordered in April 1919, marked a desperate turning point for the family. At Aitodor, Xenia hurriedly gathered what valuables she could salvage from her life of luxury: precious pearls discreetly sewn into the hems of her clothing for safekeeping, and a select handful of exquisite Fabergé eggs that had belonged to her mother, Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna. These items represented not just material wealth, but irreplaceable family heirlooms from the imperial era. Boarding the ship with her children and other relatives, Xenia stood on the quarterdeck as the vessel departed, watching the picturesque shores of Yalta fade into the distance. Overwhelmed by the finality of exile, she penned a poignant line in her diary about the profound sense of homelessness that now defined her existence. Years later, reflecting on this moment, she would paste a pressed wildflower from Crimea beside the entry. Remarkably, those delicate petals remain preserved in her diary, which is housed today at the Hoover Institution. Early exile years, Denmark Frogmore, 1919 to 1936. After a perilous journey that included stops in Constantinople and Malta, the evacuated Romanovs found a temporary haven in Denmark, where Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna owned the seaside villa Vidura House, shared with her sister Queen Alexandra of the United Kingdom. The villa, located on the coast north of Copenhagen, provided a brief lull from the upheaval, its air filled with the comforting sense of salt from the nearby sea and freshly baked rye bread from the kitchen. However, the family's financial reality was stark. Their once vast fortunes had been confiscated or left behind in Russia, forcing them to rely on pawning jewelry and other treasures to sustain themselves. Even the cherished Fabergé eggs were eventually auctioned off, piece by piece, to cover basic living expenses. Xenia, ever resilient, maintained a wry sense of humor amid the hardship, joking to her sister, Grand Duchess Olga, "We sell memories ounce by ounce." Despite these efforts, the proceeds proved insufficient to maintain their lifestyle, highlighting the harsh transition from imperial opulence to the uncertainties of exile. By 1925, with resources dwindling and the need for stability growing, Xenia accepted a discreet offer of support from King George V, a grace and favor residence at Frogmore Cottage, a modest, ivy-clad home on the Windsor Castle estate, known for its damp interiors and secluded gardens. This move to England represented a new chapter, far removed from the extravagance of her youth. Adapting to her reduced circumstances, Xenia took it upon herself to learn practical skills she had never needed before, such as English bookkeeping, to manage her limited finances meticulously. She also tended a small kitchen garden, growing vegetables to supplement her household, and familiarized herself with everyday economies, like purchasing coal by the sack, negotiating prices, and monitoring usage to stretch her budget. For a woman who had been raised amidst the splendor of malachite columns, gilded ballrooms, and endless court rituals in St. Petersburg's palaces, this life was profoundly humiliating, stripping away the trappings of royalty. Yet it also brought an unexpected sense of liberation, allowing her to forge a self-reliant identity free from the rigid protocols of the past, and to focus on her family's well-being in a quieter, more independent existence. Frogmore Cottage, with its persistent issues like leaky chimneys that allowed dampness to seep into the rooms, became Grand Duchess Xenia's primary residence and operational base for 11 challenging years following her arrival in 1925. During this period, she navigated the financial strains of exile by making difficult sacrifices, such as pawning a valuable sapphire bracelet to cover the tuition fees for her son Andrei's education at the prestigious Eton College. To generate additional income, Xenia turned to creative endeavors, including embroidering fine linen items that she sold at bazaars organized by the white Russian émigré community, which supported fellow exiles from the former Russian Empire. She also took on the role of organizer for charity balls, events that brought together an eclectic mix of attendees ranging from displaced European princes and aristocrats to prominent figures from London's artistic circles, such as those associated with the Bloomsbury Group. These activities not only helped sustain her household, but also fostered a sense of community among the scattered Russian diaspora. However, the limitations of royal hospitality became evident after the death of King George V in January 1936, when an official from the court informed Xenia that Frogmore Cottage must revert to the immediate royal family, signaling an impending eviction and adding to the uncertainty of her situation. Death of Maria Feodorovna and the Locked Cedar Chest, Story 1. When Maria Feodorovna died in 1928, a locked cedar chest arrived from Copenhagen under diplomatic seal. Witnesses, among them Queen Mary, watched Xenia lift the lid. Inside glittered tiaras, demi-parures, and miniature Easter eggs. A court jeweler murmured a guess of £700,000, a king's ransom in Depression-era England. Only a fraction ever reached the sisters' bank accounts. By the 1960s, Canadian tabloids sniffed a diamond scandal, alleging that intermediaries skimmed most of the proceeds, while Olga could afford only a modest Danish bungalow. The British and Romanov courts traded curt denials, and the full paper trail remained sealed. What is certain, a good slice of Romanov sparkle migrated quietly into the modern Windsor jewel cases. Hampton Court years, 1937 to 1960. In the wake of King George V's passing and the subsequent pressure to vacate Frogmore Cottage, the newly ascended King Edward VIII, prior to his abdication later that year, intervened decisively to resolve Xenia's housing dilemma. In a single afternoon meeting, he arranged for her to relocate to Wilderness House, a property within the Hampton Court Palace estate, demonstrating a continued thread of familial support from the British monarchy. This move, finalized in 1937, marked a significant shift for Xenia, who prepared for the transition by packing her remaining possessions, including essential trunks filled with personal belongings and a well-worn samovar that symbolized her Russian heritage and served as a reminder of traditional tea rituals from her past life, Upon her arrival at Wilderness House in 1937, Xenia found herself in a modest former gardener's lodge nestled behind the historic Tudor walls of Hampton Court Palace, a setting that offered a blend of seclusion and historical charm, but required adaptation to its simpler accommodations. Accompanying her was a steadfast companion, Mother Martha, a Russian Orthodox nun described by biographer James Pope Hennessy as having the face of a powerful elderly man, reflecting her strong, resolute features and demeanor. Mother Martha assumed responsibility for managing the household with an unyielding sense of calm and efficiency, handling daily tasks that included feeding the swans along the nearby River Thames and meticulously tracking every farthing of Xenia's increasingly limited financial resources to ensure the family's survival in exile. Impact of World War II, 1939 to 1945. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 brought direct and devastating consequences to Xenia's life at Wilderness House, culminating in a traumatic event on the 20th of October 1940 when a bomb dropped by the German Luftwaffe exploded in close proximity to the property during an air raid. The blast caused the windows to shatter inward, scattering glass and debris throughout the rooms and exacerbating the chaos of the moment. Tragically, Xenia's daughter-in-law, Princess Elizabeth Ruffo de Sasso, who was already suffering from terminal cancer and in a weakened state, succumbed to her injuries from the explosion that very evening, adding profound personal loss to the horrors of war. In response to the escalating dangers in London, Xenia took immediate action to safeguard her grandchildren by evacuating them to the relative safety of Craigavon Lodge on the Balmoral estate in Scotland, a remote location provided through royal connections. There, amid the wartime austerity, she spent evenings reading aloud from children's classics, like Winnie the Pooh by the flickering light of the fireplace, creating moments of warmth and normalcy. Reflecting on this period, Xenia later described it as discovering a second childhood by necessity, as the circumstances forced her to embrace a simpler, more nurturing role far removed from her imperial past. Watercolor Pansies, Art and Legacy. In response to her impoverished state in exile, Xenia revived a hobby from her childhood, creating delicate miniature watercolor cards. This artistic pursuit, which she had enjoyed during her early years in Russia, became a practical means of expression and occasionally income. She focused on painting small-scale works, often on cardstock, that reflected her refined tastes and emotional resilience, transforming a leisurely pastime into a symbol of her adaptability in the face of adversity. Xenia's preferred motif for these watercolor cards was pansies, chosen for their deep symbolic meanings. Purple pansies represented faith, evoking a sense of spiritual steadfastness, while yellow ones symbolized memory, perhaps alluding to her reflections on a lost era of Russian imperial grandeur. She meticulously signed each piece with a tiny intertwined monogram, XA, standing for Xenia Alexandrovna, adding a personal and royal touch that authenticated her work. These cards were characterized by their intricate detail, vibrant colors, and compact size, making them intimate keepsakes rather than large-scale artworks. In the 1950s, as Xenia continued her life in exile at places like Wilderness House and Hampton Court Palace, she channeled her artistic output toward philanthropy. She donated stacks of these miniature watercolor cards to auctions organized for Russian refugees, many of whom were displaced by the ongoing effects of the Revolution and World War II. The proceeds from these sales were specifically used to raise school fees and educational support for children of Russian émigrés, youngsters she would never personally meet but whose future she sought to improve through her quiet acts of generosity. This period highlighted her enduring commitment to her heritage and community, even in her later years. Today, Xenia's miniature watercolor cards are highly prized by collectors for their historical significance, artistic charm, and connection to the Romanov dynasty. One notable example, an Easter greeting card featuring a pansy with the inscription "Christ is risen," rendered as "Christos Voskrese" in Cyrillic, and painted in yellow, surfaced in Seattle in 2024, offered through a fine art dealer specializing in Russian artifacts. This piece, painted on cardstock with purple and yellow hues, exemplifies her style and has drawn attention from enthusiasts worldwide. Additionally, at the archives of Hampton Court Palace, visitors can still view a preserved watercolor of pansies, arranged in a small green vase. On the back, Xenia scribbled a personal note in English, "The vase you gave me," adding a layer of intimate sentiment to the artwork. These surviving items underscore the enduring value of her creations, bridging her personal history with contemporary interest in Romanov memorabilia. Mother Martha, guardian and mystery. Wilderness House soon became a fortress of privacy policed by Mother Martha, the stern Orthodox nun who managed Xenia's dwindling household. Visitors recall one unforgettable scene. When a tabloid photographer crept over the hedge, Martha stormed out brandishing a broom and chased him clear to the Thames towpath, habit flying, icons rattling in her pocket. Behind that comic image lay absolute devotion. She screened letters, balanced the accounts to the last farthing, and guarded the Duchess's dignity with a zeal that could feel menacing to outsiders. In the hours following Xenia's death, Mother Martha abruptly vanished from Wilderness House, an act that shocked the household staff and family members alike. Her disappearance was not solitary. It was accompanied by the removal of several valuable items, including jewelry from Xenia's remaining collection, cash that had been carefully managed for daily expenses, and private papers that likely contained personal correspondences, diaries, and documents of historical significance. Upon checking her room in the wake of this sudden departure, the staff found it eerily stripped bare, with only a single religious icon left behind, a poignant remnant of her Orthodox faith and perhaps a deliberate symbol of her spiritual convictions amidst the betrayal. The mysterious circumstances surrounding Mother Martha's vanishing prompted an official response from authorities, leading Scotland Yard to open a formal inquiry into the matter shortly after Xenia's death in 1960. Investigators examined the scene at Wilderness House, interviewed staff and family members, and pursued leads related to the missing items, which held both sentimental and monetary value. Despite these efforts, no concrete evidence or trace of Mother Martha ever surfaced, leaving the case unresolved and adding a layer of intrigue to the Duchess's final chapter. The inquiry eventually faded without charges or recoveries, consigning the incident to the realm of unsolved historical enigmas. In the absence of definitive answers from the investigation, family lore emerged to fill the void, perpetuating tales about Mother Martha's fate that blended fact with speculation. According to these handed-down stories within the Romanov descendants, the nun boarded a night ferry bound for Calais, France, shortly after Xenia's death, clutching a carpet bag that reportedly jingled with the sound of concealed Fabergé items, precious artifacts that had survived the family's earlier hardships and symbolized the lost imperial opulence. Whether rooted in verifiable events or embellished over time, this narrative transformed Mother Martha into an unintended ghost story in the Duchess's biography, evoking an almost czarist echo where unwavering loyalty had curdled into acts of larceny. Her enigmatic end served as a cautionary tale of devotion gone awry, haunting the family's memory and underscoring the complex interplay of trust and betrayal in the twilight of royal exile. The Anastasia Imposter Saga, 1920s, 1990s. The most persistent rumor to stalk every Romanov in exile was the claim that Tsar Nicholas II's youngest daughter, Anastasia, had somehow survived the cellar at Ekaterinburg. In 1920, a suicidal factory worker in Berlin, soon styling herself Anna Anderson, declared that she was the lost Grand Duchess. Supporters begged Xenia for an endorsement, but she refused to meet the woman, calling the story cruel theatrics. Her husband Sandro publicly condemned the fortune hunters who fed on Romanov grief. A German lawsuit dragged on for decades, threatening whatever foreign assets the family still possessed, until DNA tests in the 1990s finally proved Anderson was no Romanov at all, but a Polish imposter named Franciszka Szankowska. The verdict vindicated Xenia's instinctive silence, yet the episode showed how exile could be hijacked by strangers hungry for royalty that no longer existed. By the late 1920s, as Anderson's story circulated widely in European circles, her advocates actively sought endorsements from prominent Romanovs to bolster her credibility. They specifically pressed Grand Duchess Xenia Alexandrovna, Nicholas II's sister living in exile in England, for her public support or recognition of Anderson as her niece. Xenia, however, chose to ignore these overtures entirely, refusing to engage with what she viewed as a dubious and intrusive claim. This period marked an intensification of the pressure on the family, as Anderson's narrative threatened to reopen wounds from the revolution and exploit the Romanovs' vulnerabilities. Xenia's husband, Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich, was outspoken in his rejection of Anderson and her backers. He publicly denounced the vileness of those he labeled fortune hunters, accusing them of preying on the Romanov tragedy for personal gain. Sandro's strong words reflected the broader family's frustration and protective stance, emphasizing how such claims not only dishonored the memory of the deceased, but also risked tarnishing the survivors' reputations. His condemnation added to the growing chorus of skepticism within Romanov circles, highlighting the emotional toll on Xenia and her immediate family. Earlier in the decade, Xenia's aunt, Grand Duchess Olga, referring to a key family member involved in the scrutiny, took a more direct approach to confronting the claim. In 1925, she subjected Anna Anderson to an intense and grueling 4-day interview in Berlin, probing her knowledge of family details, personal anecdotes, and court life to test her authenticity. At the conclusion of this exhaustive encounter, Grand Duchess Olga firmly declared Anderson to be a complete stranger, with no resemblance or connection to the real Anastasia. This rejection, based on first-hand assessment, strengthened the family's united front against the impostor and provided early evidence of the claim's falsehood. The controversy escalated when Anna Anderson pursued a prolonged lawsuit in German courts, beginning in 1938 and dragging on until 1970, seeking legal recognition as Grand Duchess Anastasia. This legal battle posed a direct threat to whatever remained of Nicholas II's foreign assets, including bank accounts and investments held abroad, as a successful claim could have allowed Anderson to siphon off these resources as inheritance. For Xenia and other Romanovs, the lawsuit represented not just a financial risk, but a prolonged invasion of their personal history, forcing them to relitigate the painful events of 1918 in public forums and defend against opportunistic exploitation. Decades after the initial claims and family rejections, scientific advancements provided conclusive proof. In the 1990s, DNA testing on tissue samples from Anna Anderson preserved from a 1979 surgery and analyzed after her death in 1984, definitively showed that she was not related to the Romanov family, but was instead Franziska Szankowska, a Polish factory worker. Further DNA analysis of the Romanov remains exhumed in the early 1990s confirmed the execution of the entire imperial family, including Anastasia vindicating the skeptics like Xenia, Sandro, and Grand Duchess Olga, who had dismissed the claim from the outset. Death and archival legacy, 1960 present. Grand Duchess Xenia Alexandrovna passed away on April the 20th, 1960, at the age of 85, in her residence at Wilderness House within the Hampton Court Palace estate in England, where she had lived for over 2 decades following her exile from Russia. Her death marked the conclusion of a life that had spanned the heights of imperial Russia and the depths of revolutionary upheaval, exile, and adaptation to a vastly different world. In accordance with her expressed wishes, her remains were transported to the French Riviera for burial at the Cimetière de Roquebrune Cap Martin in Roquebrune, a serene coastal location overlooking the Mediterranean Sea, where she was interred beside her husband, Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich, known affectionately as Sandro, who had predeceased her in 1933. This choice of resting place symbolized her desire to be reunited with her lifelong partner in a setting far removed from the turmoil of their early years, reflecting the personal bonds that endured amid the scattering of the Romanov family. From St. Petersburg palaces to Crimean cliffs, from a Danish villa to Frogmore Cottage and finally Wilderness House at Hampton Court, Xenia's addresses trace a zigzag atlas of privilege, peril, and perseverance, each move a square on the chessboard of 20th century upheaval. Following her death, probate records documented Grand Duchess Xenia's estate as relatively small, reflecting the financial diminutions she had endured through decades of exile, where much of the family's wealth had been lost, pawned, or sold to sustain daily life. Despite the modesty of her material inheritance, her true legacy lay in the archival realm, comprising an extensive collection of personal documents that provided invaluable insights into the Romanov era. This bequest included approximately 8.9 linear feet of diaries, letters, and related materials, now preserved at Stanford University's Hoover Institution in California, forming one of the most intimate and comprehensive caches of Romanov family records available to researchers. The collection encompasses handwritten diaries chronicling her daily experiences, family correspondences that reveal private emotions and relationships, printed matter such as clippings and ephemera from her life in exile, and photographs capturing moments from imperial gatherings to émigré hardships. These items were carefully assembled over her lifetime and donated posthumously, ensuring their preservation for scholarly purposes. Xenia's diaries, letters, and photographs, now preserved at Stanford's Hoover Institution, form one of the richest first-hand records of late imperial Russia in private hands. For 6 decades, historians have mined them to illuminate the court's final years, the 1917 collapse, and the long psychology of exile. Resilience and lessons. A century after the HMS Marlborough raised anchor in 1919 to evacuate Xenia and her relatives from Crimea, her story continues to shape collective memories of Anglo-Russian relations, particularly themes of refuge, resilience, and cultural exchange. As one of the few surviving Romanovs who found sanctuary in Britain through royal connections, Xenia exemplified how exile could be endured with a combination of humor, evident in her witty correspondences, discipline in managing limited resources, and simple joys like organizing midsummer picnics under the Tudor chimneys of her English homes. Her life narrative has influenced biographies, documentaries, and public perceptions, portraying her as a bridge between the lost world of Tsarist Russia and the modern West, where personal fortitude transformed tragedy into a testament of survival. In her final years at Wilderness House, Grand Duchess Xenia maintained a modest yet evocative household that blended remnants of her Russian heritage with her adapted English surroundings. The property featured roses climbing the brick exterior, adding a touch of natural beauty to the former gardener's lodge. Inside, a traditional Russian samovar often hissed in the tiny parlor, serving as a functional and symbolic link to her cultural roots through daily tea rituals. On the windowsills, she would lay out pansy cards, watercolor paintings of flowers she created herself to dry, a creative pursuit that provided solace and a means of income through sales at charity events. Beyond the walls, post-war England focused on rebuilding its infrastructure and society, while Xenia, in quieter moments, mentally revisited memories of snowbound sleigh rides at Tsarskoye Selo, the imperial village near St. Petersburg, where she spent much of her childhood in idyllic family settings. Throughout her life, Grand Duchess Xenia embodied an unbreakable habit of resilience, adapting to profound changes with a pragmatic outlook. She once shared with a visitor the insight that homes change but habits follow, emphasizing how ingrained personal routines and attitudes could provide continuity amid displacement. This philosophy guided her through the loss of her homeland, the scattering of her family, financial hardships that required selling jewels for essentials, and the challenges of raising children in exile, transforming potential despair into purposeful endurance. Stand on the Thames path at dusk and you can just glimpse Wilderness House behind its hedge, a gardener's lodge that once sheltered an empress without a throne. Inside, Xenia kept a samovar hissing and laid out watercolor pansies to dry, insisting that small rituals could outlast lost palaces. She told a friend, "Homes change, but habits follow," a credo distilled from 40 years of dislocation. Visitors remember her mixing English thrift with Russian hospitality. Roses climbed the bricks. A battered Fabergé frame sat beside ration book tea cakes. Those habits, order, courtesy, a refusal to pity herself, became her true estate. If the Romanov saga often reads like opera, Xenia's chapter ends almost in a whisper, a brushstroke of purple and gold on a postcard, mailed to raise school fees for refugee children she would never meet. That modest generosity may be the most enduring jewel she left behind,